Hello everyone, welcome to the channel that brings you the best and most authentic accounts of attacks and sightings of the legendary Bigfoot. Before we begin today's story, I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. It's very important to us, so please subscribe and leave a comment telling me which city you're watching from. We'd love to know. Click the like button, all because.
The crisp mountain air filled my lungs as I stepped out of the car, stretching my arms above my head. The San Juan Mountains loomed before us, their peaks disappearing into a blanket of mist. My best friend Josh was already shouldering his backpack, a grin plastered across his face. "Ready for this, Matt?" he asked, his eyes gleaming with excitement. 3 days of pure wilderness. No cell phones, no internet, just us and Mother Nature. I nodded, trying to match his enthusiasm, but something about the dense forest ahead made me uneasy. "Yeah, can't wait," I replied, my voice lacking conviction. Josh didn't seem to notice my hesitation. He was already striding towards the trailhead, his long legs eating up the distance. I hurried to catch up, adjusting my pack as I went. The first hour of our hike was uneventful. We chatted about work, our plans for the future, and the latest movies we'd seen. But as we ventured deeper into the wilderness, an eerie silence descended upon the forest. The birds stopped singing, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I paused, looking around nervously. "Hey, Josh, does something feel off to you?" Josh stopped and turned back to me, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," I said, struggling to put my unease into words. "It's too quiet. Where are all the animals?" He listened for a moment, then shrugged. "Maybe we scared them off. Come on, we've got a lot of ground to cover before nightfall." We pressed on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made me jump. Josh teased me about it, but I could see that he was starting to feel it too. As we rounded a bend in the trail, a distant roar echoed through the trees. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite a bear, not quite a mountain lion, but something larger. I grabbed Josh's arm. "Did you hear that?" His face had gone pale. "Yeah, I heard it. What the hell was that?" "I don't know, but maybe we should turn back," I suggested, my heart racing. Josh hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. "No way. We've been planning this trip for months. It was probably just the wind or something. Let's keep going." I wanted to argue, but I knew how stubborn Josh could be. Reluctantly, I followed him deeper into the forest. As dusk approached, we found a small clearing to set up camp. Josh busied himself with the tent while I gathered firewood. The shadows lengthened around us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were reaching out, trying to grab us. "Hey, Matt," Josh called out. "Can you grab the food bag from my pack? I'm starving." I walked over to his backpack and started rummaging through it. As I did, I heard a twig snap in the forest behind me. I whirled around, my heart pounding. "Josh," I whispered urgently. "I think there's something out there." He looked up from the tent, annoyed. "Come on, man. Stop being so paranoid. It's probably just a deer or something." But as the words left his mouth, another roar split the air. Closer this time. Much closer. Josh's eyes widened, and he slowly stood up. "Okay," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "Maybe you're right. Let's just get the fire going and stay close to camp." We worked quickly, gathering more wood and building up a large fire. Its warmth was comforting, but the flickering flames cast grotesque shadows that seemed to come alive, dancing at the edge of the forest. We ate our dinner in tense silence, both of us jumping at every sound from the darkness beyond our little circle of light. As we cleaned up, I turned to Josh. "What do you think it is?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head. "I don't know. But it's big, whatever it is. Maybe a grizzly?" "There haven't been grizzlies in Colorado for decades," I reminded him. "Then I don't know," he snapped, fear making his voice sharp. Let's just get some sleep. We'll feel better in the morning." We retreated to our tents, but sleep was elusive. I lay awake, listening to every sound, my imagination running wild. What was out there? And why did it feel like it was hunting us? Just as I was finally drifting off, a blood-curdling scream shattered the night. I bolted upright, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. "Josh!" I yelled, fumbling for the zipper of my tent. "Josh, are you okay?" There was no answer. I tumbled out of my tent, desperate to reach my friend. The campfire had died down to embers, casting a dim red glow over the clearing. Josh's tent was on the other side of the fire pit, and as I stumbled towards it, I froze in horror. The tent was in shreds, its fabric torn apart as if by massive claws. And Josh was gone. "Josh!" I screamed, my voice echoing through the silent forest. "Josh!" A low growl answered me, and I spun around, my blood turning to ice. There at the edge of the clearing stood a massive, hair-covered figure. It was vaguely man-like, but far too large, its muscles rippling beneath matted fur. In one enormous hand it held Josh's limp form. Our eyes met, and in that moment I knew true terror. This was no animal. This was something else, something that shouldn't exist. A BigFoot. And it had my best friend. The creature let out another ear-splitting roar, and then it was gone, crashing through the underbrush with impossible speed, taking Josh with it. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, as the sounds of its retreat faded into the distance. The reality of what had just happened crashed over me like a wave, and I fell to my knees, retching. My best friend was gone, taken by a monster I'd always believed was just a legend, and I was alone in the wilderness, with no idea how to save him, or if he could even be saved. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the mountains, I realized that our hike had turned into a nightmare. The shadows of the forest seemed to press in on our small campsite as night fell. Josh and I sat huddled around the flickering campfire, our earlier bravado replaced by a palpable sense of unease. The flames danced erratically, casting grotesque, elongated shadows that appeared to writhe and twist with a life of their own. "Maybe we should have turned back," I muttered, more to myself than to Josh. Josh looked up from the fire, his face a mask of forced nonchalance. "Come on, Matt. Don't tell me you're still spooked by that noise we heard earlier." I shrugged, unwilling to admit just how unsettled I felt. "I don't know, man. Something just feels off." Josh sighed and tossed another log onto the fire. Sparks flew up into the night sky, momentarily illuminating the dense canopy above us. "Look, we've been planning this trip for months. We can't let some weird animal noises ruin it for us." I nodded, trying to convince myself as much as Josh. "Yeah, you're right. I'm probably just being paranoid." We fell into an uneasy silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. The forest around us was unnaturally quiet, devoid of the usual nocturnal sounds we'd expected to hear. No owls hooting, no small animals rustling in the underbrush. Just an oppressive, all-encompassing silence. Suddenly, a twig snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond our campfire's glow. We both jumped, our heads whipping around to peer into the inky blackness. "What was that?" I whispered, my heart racing. Josh stood up slowly, his eyes scanning the tree line. "Probably just a deer or something. I'll go check it out." I grabbed his arm. "Are you crazy? Don't go out there." He shook off my hand, forcing a laugh. "Relax, Matt, it's fine. I'll just take a quick look." Before I could protest further, Josh snatched up his flashlight and strode towards the edge of our campsite. I watched, my stomach churning with anxiety, as the beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, without warning, a massive shadow darted between the trees, moving far too fast and large to be human. Josh's flashlight beam caught it for just a split second, a blur of dark fur and massive limbs. "Holy shit!" Josh yelled, stumbling backward. "Did you see that?" I was on my feet in an instant, my own flashlight in hand. "What was it?" "Josh, what did you see?" He turned back to me, his face pale in the firelight. "I don't know. It was huge, whatever it was. Like a bear, but not a bear. It moved too fast." A low, rumbling growl emanated from the forest, sending chills down my spine. It was the same sound we'd heard earlier, but closer now. Much closer. "We need to get out of here," I said, already moving towards our tent. "Now." Josh nodded, all his earlier bravado gone. "Yeah, okay. Let's pack up and—" His words were cut off by an ear-splitting roar that shook the very ground beneath our feet. The campfire flickered wildly, as if cowering from the sound. And then, in a blur of movement almost too fast to follow, something massive burst from the tree line. I caught only glimpses: matted fur, impossibly long arms, a face that was a nightmarish blend of ape and man. Before I could even process what I was seeing, the creature had crossed the campsite in 2 enormous strides. Josh's scream pierced the night as the thing grabbed him, yanking him off his feet as if he weighed nothing at all. I stood frozen in horror, watching as my best friend was lifted into the air, kicking and thrashing. "Matt!" Josh cried out, his voice filled with terror. "Help me!" His plea snapped me out of my paralysis. I lunged forward, grabbing for Josh's outstretched hand, but I was too slow. The creature turned and loped back into the forest, carrying Josh as easily as a child might carry a doll. "No!" I screamed, stumbling after them. "Josh!" I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I ran. I could hear Josh's cries growing fainter, punctuated by the creature's guttural grunts and the sound of something large moving through the forest at incredible speed. My foot caught on a root, and I went down hard, the breath knocked from my lungs. By the time I scrambled to my feet, the sounds of pursuit had faded into the distance. Panic clawed at my throat as I spun in circles, my flashlight illuminating nothing but trees and shadows. "Josh!" I called out again, my voice breaking. "Josh, where are you?" Only the eerie silence of the forest answered me. Fighting back tears, I stumbled back towards our campsite, hoping against hope that this was all some terrible nightmare I would soon wake from. But the scene that greeted me crushed that feeble hope. The campfire was guttering, casting just enough light for me to see the destruction. Our tent was in tatters, ripped apart as if by enormous claws. Our supplies were scattered everywhere, and long, deep gouges marred the ground, claw marks far larger than any animal I'd ever seen or heard of. I sank to my knees, overwhelmed by the reality of what had just happened. My best friend had been taken by what? A BigFoot? The rational part of my mind rebelled against the idea, but I couldn't deny what I'd seen with my own eyes. As the adrenaline began to wear off, I became aware of a stinging sensation on my cheek. I touched it gingerly, my fingers coming away wet with blood. One of the branches must have cut me as I ran through the forest. I don't know how long I sat there, shivering in the dying firelight, my mind reeling. But eventually, survival instinct kicked in. I couldn't stay here. I had to find help. I had to save Josh. With shaking hands, I gathered what supplies I could salvage, stuffing them haphazardly into my backpack. As I worked, my flashlight beam caught something on the ground near where the creature had first appeared. I moved closer, my breath catching in my throat as I realized what I was seeing. A footprint. But not like any footprint I'd ever seen before. It was enormous, easily twice the size of my own foot, with clear impressions of toes and a shape that was disturbingly human-like, yet not quite human. I stared at it, my mind struggling to accept what my eyes were telling me. This was real. This was happening. And Josh's life depended on me accepting that reality and doing something about it. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the trees, I shouldered my pack and took one last look at our ruined campsite. The enormity of what lay ahead of me was overwhelming, but I pushed down my fear and took a deep breath. "I'm coming, Josh," I whispered, hoping somehow he could hear me. "I'm going to find you, I promise." With that, I turned and began walking, following the trail of destruction left by the creature. I didn't know what I was going to do when I found it or how I was going to save Josh. But I knew one thing for certain. Our weekend hiking trip had turned into a nightmare, and it was far from over. The forest loomed before me, dark and foreboding. Somewhere in its depths, a monster straight out of legend had my best friend, and I was the only one who could save him. With each step, I left behind the world I knew and ventured into a realm where myths were real and nightmares walked in daylight. The forest was a blur of green and brown as I sprinted through the undergrowth, my legs burning with exertion. The first rays of dawn barely penetrated the dense canopy, leaving me in a twilight world of shadows and uncertainty. My breath came in ragged gasps, but I couldn't stop. Wouldn't stop. Not while Josh was out there in the clutches of that thing. "Josh!" I shouted, my voice hoarse from hours of calling. "Josh, where are you?" Only the eerie silence of the forest answered me. I paused for a moment, straining my ears for any sound that might guide me. The quiet was oppressive, unnatural. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. Suddenly, a distant crash echoed through the trees, followed by a low, rumbling growl that made my hair stand on end. It was the creature, and it was on the move again. "Josh!" I yelled once more, desperation clouding my judgment. "I'm coming! Hold on!" I took off running again, heedless of the branches that whipped across my face, drawing blood. My only thought was to keep moving, to somehow catch up to that impossibly fast monster and save my friend. As I ran, my mind raced with fragmented thoughts and memories. Josh and I had been friends since childhood. We'd been through everything together: school, first loves, family tragedies. The thought of losing him to some nightmarish creature was unbearable. "This can't be happening," I muttered to myself as I vaulted over a fallen log. "Bigfoot isn't real. It can't be real." But I knew what I had seen: the massive, fur-covered body, the inhuman strength as it had snatched Josh from our campsite, the footprints that no known animal could have made. It was real, and it had my best friend. Another crash, closer this time. The beast's growls grew louder, and a chill ran down my spine as I realized I might be running straight into its lair. But I couldn't turn back now. Josh needed me. "I'm not leaving you, Josh," I panted as I pushed myself harder. "Do you hear me? I'm not giving up." The terrain became steeper, the forest floor littered with rocks and exposed roots. I stumbled more than once, my tired legs struggling to keep up with my desperate pace. But I pressed on, ignoring the burning in my muscles and the stitch in my side. Suddenly, a sound cut through the forest. A human voice, distant but unmistakable. "Matt, help me!" It was Josh. My heart leaped into my throat. He was alive. "Josh!" I screamed back. "I'm coming. Where are you?" His reply was cut off by another bone-chilling roar from the creature. It sounded angry now, and I realized with horror that my shouts might have agitated it further. I redoubled my efforts, pushing my body to its limits as I charged through the forest. The voice had come from somewhere ahead and to my left. I veered in that direction, praying I wasn't too late. The forest grew denser, the underbrush more tangled. Thorny vines tore at my clothes and skin, but I barely felt the pain. My entire world had narrowed to this chase, this desperate race to save my friend. "Josh," I called out again. "Keep talking. I need to find you." "Matt." His voice was closer now, but tinged with pain and fear. "It's taking me to—" His words were cut off by a terrifying snarl, followed by the sound of something massive crashing through the forest. "No," I yelled, pushing myself even harder. "Leave him alone, you bastard." In my panicked state, I failed to notice the root jutting out from the forest floor. My foot caught it, and I felt a sickening twist in my ankle as I pitched forward. For a moment, I was airborne, and then I was tumbling down a steep ravine I hadn't even seen. The world spun around me as I rolled down the slope, unable to stop my descent. Rocks and branches battered my body. I felt a sharp pain in my ribs as I slammed into a tree trunk. Finally, mercifully, I came to a stop at the bottom of the ravine. I lay there, dazed and in agony, my vision swimming. Every breath sent a stab of pain through my chest. My ankle throbbed, and I could feel warm blood trickling down my face from a gash on my forehead. "Josh?" I croaked, trying to push myself up, but my battered body refused to cooperate, and I collapsed back onto the damp forest floor. As I lay there fighting to stay conscious, I heard it. Josh's voice, faint and fading. "Matt, help." Then, silence. Tears of frustration and pain welled up in my eyes. I had failed. I had let Josh down when he needed me most. "I'm sorry," I whispered into the uncaring forest. "I'm so sorry, Josh." The pain and exhaustion finally overwhelmed me, and I felt myself slipping into unconsciousness. As the darkness closed in, one last terrible thought flashed through my mind. When I wake up? If I wake up, will it be too late? The forest seemed to lean in close, as if listening to my ragged breathing. Somewhere in its depths, a monster beyond belief had taken my best friend. And I, his only hope for rescue, lay broken and useless at the bottom of a ravine. As I faded into unconsciousness, I could have sworn I heard the creature's low, rumbling growl echoing through the trees. It sounded almost triumphant. The last thing I remember before the darkness took me was a sense of utter helplessness. Josh was gone, taken by a nightmare made flesh, and I had no idea how to save him, or even if he could be saved. The chase was over, and I had lost. When I finally regained consciousness, the sun was high in the sky, filtering through the canopy in dappled patterns. For a moment I lay there, confused and disoriented. Then the memories came flooding back. The attack, the chase, my fall. "Josh," I groaned, forcing myself to sit up despite the protests of my battered body. Every movement sent waves of pain through me. My ribs ached, and my ankle was swollen to twice its normal size. But I couldn't stay here. I had to keep moving, had to find Josh. Using a nearby tree for support, I slowly, painfully, got to my feet. The world spun for a moment, and I had to close my eyes until the dizziness passed. When I opened them again, I took stock of my surroundings. The ravine I had fallen into was steep, but not impassable. With gritted teeth, I began to climb, using roots and rocks as handholds. Each step was agony, but I forced myself onward, Josh's fading cries for help echoing in my memory. As I neared the top of the ravine, a twig snapped somewhere in the forest above me. I froze, my heart pounding. Was it the creature coming back to finish me off? "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering. "Is someone there?" No response. Just the eerie silence that had become all too familiar. I pulled myself over the edge of the ravine, collapsing onto level ground. As I lay there, catching my breath, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Footprints. Massive, inhuman footprints, just like the ones at our campsite, and they were fresh. The creature had been here probably while I was unconscious. It had been close enough to finish me off, but for some reason, it hadn't. Why? A horrible thought occurred to me. What if it was toying with me? What if this was all some sick game to it? I shook my head, trying to clear away the paranoid thoughts. I couldn't afford to think like that. Josh needed me, and I had already wasted too much time. With a groan of pain, I got to my feet once more. The footprints led off into the forest, and I had no choice but to follow them. It was my only lead, my only hope of finding Josh. As I limped after the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest seemed to press in around me, full of hidden eyes and unseen dangers. But I pressed on, driven by a desperate need to save my friend. "I'm coming, Josh," I muttered, more to keep my own spirits up than anything else. "Just hold on. I'm coming." The chase had begun again, but this time, I was the hunter, not the hunted, and somewhere in the depths of this nightmare forest, a monster was waiting. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I limped back towards our campsite, each step sending jolts of pain through my injured ankle. The events of the night before felt like a surreal nightmare, but the aches in my body and the gnawing fear in my gut were all too real. As I broke through the tree line into our clearing, I gasped in horror. In the harsh light of day, the destruction was even more apparent. Our tent lay in tatters, shredded beyond repair. Our supplies were scattered across the ground, crushed and broken. Deep gouges marred the earth, testament to the incredible strength of the creature that had taken Josh. "Oh God," I whispered, sinking to my knees. "This is really happening." I forced myself to my feet, gritting my teeth against the pain. I had to keep moving. Josh was out there somewhere, counting on me. I gathered what supplies I could salvage: a half-crushed first aid kit, a water bottle, some energy bars that had somehow survived the carnage. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. With one last look at the ruins of our campsite, I turned and plunged back into the forest, following the trail of destruction left by the creature. The massive footprints were easy to track, each one a reminder of the impossible horror I was pursuing. "Josh!" I called out, my voice echoing through the trees. "Josh, can you hear me?" Only silence answered. I pressed on, my calls growing more desperate with each passing hour. "Josh, please, answer me." My voice grew hoarse, but I couldn't stop. The thought of Josh out there, alone and terrified, drove me forward despite my exhaustion and pain. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the forest around me began to change. The familiar pines and oaks gave way to older, stranger trees. The underbrush grew thicker, more primordial somehow. I realized with a sinking feeling that I was entering a part of the forest that likely hadn't seen human footsteps in centuries. The footprints I was following grew fresher. My heart raced as I realized I might be getting close. But close to what? I had no weapon, no plan, just a desperate need to find my friend. Suddenly, a new scent cut through the earthy smell of the forest, the unmistakable stench of decay. My stomach churned, but I pressed on, following my nose as much as the footprints now. The trees thinned out, revealing a small clearing. And there, set into the side of a hill, was a yawning cave entrance. The stench was stronger here, almost overpowering. Dark stains that looked horribly like dried blood marked the rocks around the entrance. "Josh?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Are you in there?" Silence. But as I stood there, straining my ears, I thought I heard something. A faint shuffling sound, coming from deep within the cave. I fumbled in my pack for my flashlight, praying the batteries still worked after everything that had happened. To my relief, a weak beam of light sputtered to life. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the cave. The darkness seemed to swallow me whole, my pitiful light barely penetrating a few feet ahead. The air was thick and musty, heavy with the scent of decay and something else. Something musky and animal. "Josh?" I called again, my voice echoing off the damp stone walls. "It's Matt. I'm here to help you." I moved deeper into the cave, my light revealing disturbing scenes with each step. Bones littered the floor, some animal, some disturbingly human-like. And there, caught on a jagged rock, was a scrap of familiar fabric. My heart leaped into my throat as I recognized it. A piece of Josh's favorite hiking shirt. I grabbed it with trembling hands, holding it up to my light. "Oh God, Josh," I whispered. "What has it done to you?" As if in answer, a low growl echoed through the cave. I spun around, my light dancing wildly across the walls. And that's when I saw them. Massive claw marks, scored deep into the solid rock. My mind reeled, trying to comprehend the strength it would take to leave such marks. The shuffling sound came again, closer this time. My light caught a glimpse of movement in a side tunnel. "Josh?" I called out, hope warring with terror in my voice. "Is that you?" No answer, but the shuffling grew louder. Something was coming towards me. My hand shook, the beam of light jumping erratically across the cave walls. And then, suddenly, it was there. A massive shape, filling the tunnel entrance. My light glinted off matted fur, illuminated a face that was a nightmarish blend of ape and man. And the eyes. Dear God, the eyes. They glowed with an intelligence that was terrifyingly inhuman. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. The creature, the BigFoot, took a lumbering step forward. In one massive hand it dragged something. No, someone. "Josh!" I cried out, finally finding my voice. My friend hung limply in the creature's grasp, his clothes torn and bloody. But at the sound of my voice, his head lifted slightly. "Matt?" he croaked, his voice weak and filled with pain. You came." The creature roared, the sound deafening in the confined space of the cave. It lifted Josh effortlessly, holding him up like a shield between us. "Let him go," I shouted, surprised by the strength in my own voice. "Please, he's my friend, don't hurt him." The BigFoot tilted its head, regarding me with those terrifyingly intelligent eyes. For a moment I dared to hope it understood me. But then it growled again, a low, menacing sound that shook dust from the cave ceiling. I took a step forward, my hands raised in what I hoped was a non-threatening gesture. "Please," I said again, softer this time. "We mean you no harm. Just let us go." The creature's eyes narrowed. It took another lumbering step forward, still holding Josh between us. I could see my friend more clearly now, and my heart sank. He was in bad shape, covered in cuts and bruises. One arm hung at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. "Matt," Josh whispered, his eyes filled with terror. "Run. Save yourself." I shook my head. "Not without you." The BigFoot roared again, clearly agitated by our exchange. It swung Josh around, eliciting a cry of pain from my friend. I winced, feeling utterly helpless. Okay, I said, taking a step back. "I'm not going to do anything. Just don't hurt him anymore. Please." The creature regarded me for a long moment, its breath coming in heavy snorts. Then with shocking speed it turned and lumbered back down the tunnel, dragging Josh with it. "No!" I cried out, starting forward. But I was too slow, too weak. By the time I reached the tunnel entrance, they were gone, swallowed up by the darkness. I stood there, my light beam dancing uselessly across the empty tunnel. Tears of frustration and fear rolled down my cheeks. I had been so close to saving Josh, to ending this nightmare. But it wasn't over. I couldn't give up now, not when I knew Josh was still alive. Somewhere in the depths of this cave, my best friend was counting on me, and I wasn't going to let him down again. With a deep breath, I stepped into the tunnel. The darkness closed in around me, thick and oppressive. But I pressed on, guided by the faint sounds of movement ahead and the desperate hope in my heart. "Hold on, Josh," I whispered into the darkness. "I'm coming. Whatever it takes. I'm going to get you out of here." The cave seemed to absorb my words, the silence pressing in on me from all sides. But I kept moving, one painful step at a time. Somewhere ahead, a monster waited. But so did my friend, and I was determined to face whatever horrors this cave held to bring him home. The darkness of the cave pressed in on me from all sides, my feeble flashlight barely piercing the gloom. Every shadow seemed to move, every drip of water echoing like footsteps. I pushed forward, ignoring the pain in my ankle and the fear clawing at my throat. Josh needed me. That was all that mattered. "Josh!" I called out, my voice bouncing off the damp stone walls. "Can you hear me?" Only silence answered. I took another step forward, my light catching on something ahead. A tunnel branched off to the left, disappearing into inky blackness. As I approached, a faint sound reached my ears, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very rock beneath my feet. My blood ran cold. I knew that sound. It was the same growl I'd heard just before the creature had taken Josh. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it would echo through the cave. The growl came again, louder this time, closer. And then, in the beam of my flashlight, I saw movement. Two eyes glowed in the darkness, reflecting the light like a cat's. But these were no house cat's eyes. They were huge, intelligent, and filled with a primal hunger that made my skin crawl. "Oh God," I whispered, stumbling backward. The creature, the Bigfoot, emerged from the shadows with agonizing slowness. It was even more terrifying up close. Matted fur covered its massive frame, caked with mud and what looked horribly like dried blood. I prayed it wasn't Josh's. Its face was a nightmarish blend of ape and man with a heavy brow and a mouth full of yellowed teeth. But it was the eyes that held me transfixed. There was an intelligence there, a spark of something almost human, and that made it all the more horrifying. For a moment we stood there, human and monster, locked in a stare that seemed to stretch for an eternity. Then the spell broke. With a roar that shook dust from the cave ceiling, the Bigfoot charged. Its speed was terrifying, closing the distance between us in the blink of an eye. Adrenaline surged through me, pushing away the pain and exhaustion. I dove to the side, feeling the wind from the creature's massive arm as it swiped at where I'd been standing. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. "Josh!" I screamed, scrambling to my feet. "Josh, where are you?" The Bigfoot roared again, spinning around with surprising agility for something so large. Its eyes locked onto me, filled with rage and hunger. I backed away, my mind racing. I had no weapon, no plan, just a desperate need to find Josh and get us both out of this nightmare alive. "Please," I said, holding up my hands. "We don't want any trouble. Just let us go." The creature tilted its head as if considering my words. For a moment I dared to hope it understood. Then it charged again. I turned and ran, ignoring the stabbing pain in my ankle. The tunnel twisted and turned, branching off in multiple directions. I chose paths at random, driven by blind panic and the terrifying sounds of pursuit behind me. "Josh!" I called out between gasping breaths. "Josh, answer me!" A faint sound reached my ears, barely audible over the pounding of my heart and the roars of the creature behind me. It sounded like a voice. "Matt?" The call was weak, filled with pain, but unmistakably Josh's voice. "Matt, is that you?" "Josh!" I shouted back, relief flooding through me. "Where are you?" "Here," came the feeble reply. "I'm here. But Matt, be careful. It's—" His words were cut off by another earth-shaking roar. I spun around to see the Bigfoot at the end of the tunnel, its massive frame blocking out what little light filtered through. "Run, Matt!" Josh's voice echoed from somewhere ahead. "Get out of here." But I couldn't leave. Not without Josh. I had come too far, been through too much to abandon him now. I looked around desperately for something, anything I could use as a weapon. My light fell on a loose chunk of rock about the size of a softball. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. I scooped up the rock, its weight reassuring in my hand. The Bigfoot advanced slowly, its eyes never leaving me. It seemed almost cautious now, as if it had realized I wasn't going to be such easy prey. "Come on, you bastard," I muttered, tightening my grip on the rock. "Come and get me." As if in response to my challenge, the creature charged. I waited until the last possible second, then hurled the rock with all my strength. It struck the Bigfoot square in the face, eliciting a roar of pain and rage. I didn't wait to see the effect. I turned and ran, following the sound of Josh's voice. The tunnel opened up into a larger cavern, dimly lit by a crack in the ceiling far above. And there, huddled against the far wall, was Josh. "Josh!" I cried out, rushing to his side. "Oh God, Josh, are you okay?" He looked up at me, his face pale and drawn with pain. "Matt? How did you find me?" "I'll explain later," I said, already trying to help him to his feet. "We need to get out of here. Now." A roar from the tunnel entrance reminded us of the imminent danger. The Bigfoot appeared, blood matting the fur on its face where my rock had struck. Its eyes blazed with murderous rage. "Go," Josh said weakly, pushing me away. "Save yourself. I'll slow it down." "Not a chance," I growled, pulling his arm over my shoulder. "We're getting out of here together or not at all." The creature advanced slowly, its massive fists clenched at its sides. I looked around desperately for an escape route. The cavern was a dead end, with only the tunnel we'd come through as an exit now blocked by hundreds of pounds of angry Bigfoot. "Matt," Josh whispered, his voice filled with fear. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I got us into this." I squeezed his arm. "Hey, we're not done yet. Remember that time in high school when we got cornered by those guys from the rival football team? We got out of that, didn't we?" Josh managed a weak chuckle. "Yeah, but they weren't 8 feet tall and covered in fur." "Details," I said, trying to inject some confidence into my voice. "We'll figure this out. Together." The Bigfoot roared again, the sound deafening in the confined space of the cavern. It took another step forward, its massive frame blocking out the light from the tunnel. I glanced up at the crack in the ceiling, an idea forming. It was crazy, probably suicidal, but it was all we had. "Josh," I said, my eyes never leaving the advancing creature. "When I say run, I need you to run. Head for the tunnel. Don't look back. Don't stop. Just run. Got it?" "What? Matt, no, I won't leave you." "Trust me," I said, giving his arm another squeeze. "Please, Josh, trust me." He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Okay, I trust you." I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I was about to do. The Bigfoot was only a few yards away now, close enough that I could smell its musky animal odor. "Hey!" I shouted, stepping forward. "Yeah, you big ugly son of a bitch." The creature's eyes locked onto me, its lip curling in a snarl. "You want us?" I continued, my voice echoing off the cavern walls. "Come and get us." With a roar of rage, the Bigfoot charged. At the last possible second, I yelled, "Now, Josh, run!" I dove to the side as Josh stumbled towards the tunnel entrance. The creature, focused on me, didn't even notice him. Its charge carried it forward, straight towards the cavern wall. Time seemed to slow down. I watched as the Bigfoot realized its mistake, tried to change direction. But its momentum was too great, its bulk too massive. It slammed into the wall with earth-shaking force. The impact sent tremors through the entire cavern. Dust and small rocks rained down from above. And then, with a sound like thunder, the crack in the ceiling began to widen. "Run!" I screamed, scrambling to my feet. "Josh, run!" We stumbled towards the tunnel entrance as the cavern ceiling began to collapse. Massive chunks of rock crashed down around us, missing us by inches. The Bigfoot roared in fury and fear, trapped beneath the falling debris. We reached the tunnel just as the last of the ceiling came down. The dust was choking, filling the air and making it hard to breathe. But we kept moving, supporting each other as we stumbled through the darkness. "Matt," Josh gasped between coughs. Is it dead?" I glanced back at the collapsed cavern. There was no sign of movement in the pile of rubble, no sound except the settling of rocks. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I'm not sticking around to find out. Come on, we need to get out of here." We made our way through the twisting tunnels, guided by the faint light filtering in from the cave entrance. Every shadow made us jump, every sound had us looking over our shoulders, but nothing pursued us. Finally, after what felt like hours, we emerged into the sunlight. The forest had never looked so beautiful. We collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air, our bodies aching from the ordeal we'd been through. For a long moment, we just lay there, letting the reality of our survival sink in. Then Josh turned to me, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "You came for me," he said softly. "You actually came for me." I managed a weak smile. "Of course I did. You're my best friend. I wasn't going to leave you to be Bigfoot Chow." Josh laughed, then winced in pain. God, it hurts to laugh. I think that thing broke a couple of my ribs. "We need to get you to a hospital," I said, slowly sitting up. "Can you walk?" He nodded, grimacing as he pushed himself to a sitting position. "Yeah, I think so. But Matt, what are we going to tell people about what happened?" I looked back at the cave entrance, a shiver running down my spine. "The truth," I said finally. "We tell them the truth, and hope they believe us." Josh nodded slowly. "And if they don't?" I met his gaze, seeing my own fear and uncertainty reflected there. Then we have each other's backs, like always. We helped each other to our feet, leaning on each other for support as we began the long trek back to civilization. The forest around us was quiet, but now it felt more like peace than the ominous silence of before. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I glanced back at the cave one last time. For a moment, I thought I saw movement in the shadows of the entrance, a large shape watching us go. But then I blinked, and it was gone, just another shadow in a forest full of them. "Come on," I said, turning back to the path ahead. "Let's go home." We left the cave behind us, carrying the weight of our incredible, terrifying experience. The world felt different now, larger and more mysterious. But we had survived. We had faced a monster and lived to tell the tale. And whatever came next, whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew one thing for certain. We would face them together. The forest was a blur of green and brown as I crashed through the underbrush, my twisted ankle screaming in agony with every step. But I couldn't stop. The thunderous footsteps behind me were a constant reminder of the horror that pursued me, each impact sending tremors through the ground. "Josh!" I yelled between gasping breaths. "Josh, where are you?" There was no answer. My heart clenched with fear for my friend, but I couldn't afford to slow down. The BigFoot's enraged roars were getting closer, the creature's impossibly long strides eating up the distance between us. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The beast was terrifyingly close, its massive form bulldozing through the forest with ease. Matted fur caked with blood and dirt covered its hulking frame. And its eyes. God, those eyes. They burned with an inhuman intelligence and primal rage that chilled me to my core. "This can't be happening," I gasped, pushing myself harder despite the searing pain in my ankle. "This can't be real." But it was real. All too real. The creature's hot, fetid breath was practically on the back of my neck now. I could hear the snap of its jaws, feel the wind from its grasping hands as they swiped at me. Just when I thought it was over, that this was how I would die, I broke through the tree line and found myself on the edge of a steep embankment. Below, a river rushed by, its waters dark and forbidding. I didn't have time to think, to weigh my options. With the BigFoot right behind me, there was only one choice. I leapt. For a moment, I was airborne, the world spinning around me. Then I hit the water with a shock that drove the air from my lungs. The icy current grabbed me immediately, pulling me under and sweeping me downstream. I fought my way to the surface, gasping for air. The river tossed me about like a rag doll, slamming me into rocks and submerged logs. Each impact sent jolts of pain through my battered body, but I clung to consciousness with grim determination. "Josh!" I tried to call out, but the roar of the river drowned my voice. From the riverbank came an ear-splitting howl of frustration. I caught a glimpse of the BigFoot, pacing along the shore, its massive form silhouetted against the darkening sky. For a moment, our eyes met, and I saw something there that made my blood run cold. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Then the current pulled me around a bend and the creature disappeared from view. I turned my attention to staying afloat, fighting against the relentless pull of the river. I don't know how long I was in the water. Time lost all meaning as I struggled to keep my head above the surface. My arms and legs grew numb from the cold, and my vision began to blur. Just when I thought I couldn't hold on any longer, I spotted a fallen tree stretching out into the river. With the last of my strength, I reached out and grabbed a branch. The current tried to tear me away, but I held on with grim determination. Inch by agonizing inch, I pulled myself towards the shore. Finally, my feet touched the bottom. I staggered out of the water, collapsing onto the rocky shore. For a long moment, I just lay there, gasping for breath, my body trembling from cold and exhaustion. "Josh," I croaked, forcing myself to sit up. "Josh, are you out there?" Only the sound of the rushing river answered me. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. The forest loomed on all sides, dark and forbidding. I had no idea how far the river had carried me or in which direction our campsite lay. "Think, Matt," I muttered to myself. "Think. What would Josh do?" Josh had always been the better outdoorsman of the two of us. He would know how to navigate by the stars, how to find north without a compass. But as I looked up at the sky, all I saw were roiling storm clouds. No stars, no moon, no way to orient myself. A twig snapped in the forest behind me and I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the protests of my battered body. Had the creature found me already? Was this nightmare about to start all over again? "Josh," I called out, hating the tremor in my voice. "Is that you?" No answer, just the rustle of leaves in the wind and the ever-present roar of the river. I backed away from the tree line, my eyes straining to pierce the gathering darkness. That's when I saw it. A flicker of light in the distance, barely visible through the trees. It could have been a campfire or maybe a cabin. Either way, it meant people. Safety. I started towards the light, limping heavily on my injured ankle. Every step was agony, but the thought of finding help, of potentially finding Josh, drove me forward. As I moved deeper into the forest, doubt began to creep in. What if I was just seeing things? What if my mind, traumatized by what I'd been through, was playing tricks on me? "No," I said aloud, shaking my head. "It's real. It has to be real." I pushed on, using trees for support when my ankle threatened to give out. The light grew stronger, more defined. It was definitely a fire, and as I got closer I could hear voices. Hope surged through me. "Hello," I called out. "Is anyone there? I need help." The voices fell silent. For a moment, there was no sound but the wind in the trees and the distant rush of the river. Then a man's voice called back, "Who's there? Show yourself." I staggered into the clearing, my hands raised. "Please," I said, my voice cracking. "I need help. My friend, we were attacked." 3 men stood around a campfire, all of them staring at me with a mixture of shock and concern. One of them, a grizzled older man with a salt and pepper beard, stepped forward. "Jesus, son," he said, taking in my battered appearance. "What happened to you?" I opened my mouth to explain, but the words wouldn't come. How could I tell them what I'd seen? Who would believe me? I stammered, swaying on my feet. There was something in the woods. The world tilted sideways, and I felt myself falling. Strong hands caught me before I hit the ground. The last thing I heard before darkness claimed me was the older man's voice. "Get him by the fire, and someone radio for help. This kid's in bad shape." I drifted in and out of consciousness, catching snippets of conversation around me. Never seen anything like it. Rangers should be here soon. What about his friend? Finally, I managed to claw my way back to full awareness. I was wrapped in a warm blanket, propped up next to the fire. The 3 men were huddled nearby, speaking in low voices. When they saw I was awake, the older man approached. "Welcome back, son," he said, crouching down beside me. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck," I groaned. Where am I?" "About 10 miles downriver from the main campgrounds," he replied. "I'm Jim, by the way. That's Mike and Dave." He gestured to the other 2 men, who nodded in greeting. "Matt," I said. "My name's Matt. Listen, my friend Josh, he's still out there. We have to find him." Jim exchanged a glance with the others. "Matt, we radioed the Rangers. They're on their way, but you need to tell us what happened. What attacked you?" I hesitated, the words sticking in my throat. How could I explain what we'd encountered? They'd think I was crazy. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," I said finally. Mike, the youngest of the 3, leaned forward. "Try us," he said. "We've been coming to these woods for years. We've seen some pretty strange things." I took a deep breath, then told them everything. The attack on our campsite, the chase through the forest, the cave, the impossible creature that had taken Josh. As I spoke, I watched their faces, waiting for the disbelief, the skepticism. But instead I saw growing concern and surprisingly a glimmer of recognition. When I finished, there was a long moment of silence. Then Jim spoke, his voice low and serious. "We believe you, Matt," he said. I blinked in surprise. You do?" Dave nodded. "There have been stories about these mountains for years, sightings of something big, something that shouldn't exist. Most folks write it off as tall tales or mistaken bears. But some of us, we know better." "You've seen it?" I asked, hardly daring to believe. "Not up close," Mike said, "but we found footprints, heard noises no known animal could make. And once, a few years back, we saw something moving through the trees. Something big." "Why didn't you report it?" I demanded, anger flaring. "If people knew, maybe Josh and I wouldn't have." "Who'd believe us?" Jim cut in. "You said it yourself, kid. It sounds crazy. And the last thing we wanted was a bunch of monster hunters traipsing through these woods, disturbing it." I wanted to argue, but deep down, I knew he was right. If someone had told me about the BigFoot before this trip, I would have laughed it off. "So, what do we do now?" I asked. "Josh is still out there. We have to find him." "The Rangers are on their way," Jim said. "They'll organize a proper search. In your condition, you'd only slow them down." I shook my head, already trying to struggle to my feet. "No, I can't just sit here. Josh needs me. I have to." A wave of dizziness hit me, and I would have fallen if Dave hadn't caught me. "Easy, son," Jim said, helping me sit back down. "You're in no shape to go anywhere. The best thing you can do for your friend right now is rest and tell the Rangers everything you know when they get here." I wanted to protest, but the truth was I could barely stand. My ankle was swollen to twice its normal size, and every muscle in my body ached. As much as I hated to admit it, Jim was right. "Okay," I said finally. "But as soon as they get here, I'm going with them. I'm not abandoning Josh again." Jim nodded. "Fair enough. Now try to get some rest. We'll keep watch." As I settled back, my mind raced with thoughts of Josh. Was he still alive? Had he managed to escape? Or was he still in the clutches of that thing? "Hang on, Josh," I whispered. "I'm coming, just hang on." The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows across the clearing. In the distance, I thought I heard a low, rumbling growl. But maybe it was just the wind in the trees. Maybe. I closed my eyes, exhaustion finally overtaking me. But even as I drifted off, I knew this nightmare was far from over. The creature was still out there, somewhere in the vast, dark forest. And one way or another, I was going to find it. The fluorescent lights of the sheriff's office buzzed incessantly, their harsh glare making my eyes water. Or maybe it was exhaustion. I'd lost track of how long I'd been sitting in this uncomfortable metal chair, repeating my story over and over again to increasingly skeptical ears. Sheriff Tom Hawkins leaned back in his chair, his weathered face a mask of barely concealed disbelief. "So, let me get this straight, Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice gruff with fatigue and frustration. "You're saying a BigFoot attacked your campsite, kidnapped your friend, and chased you through the woods?" I nodded, fighting back a wave of despair. "I know how it sounds, Sheriff, but it's the truth. Every word of it." The sheriff exchanged a glance with Deputy Sarah Martinez, who stood silently in the corner, her arms crossed. I could read the doubt in their eyes, the unspoken question, was I crazy or just a liar? "Mr. Thompson," Sheriff Hawkins said, leaning forward, "we've had search and rescue teams combing those woods for the past 48 hours. They found no trace of your friend Josh, no signs of any large animal activity, and certainly no evidence of this creature you describe." "But the campsite," I protested weakly. "The destruction could have been caused by a bear," Deputy Martinez interjected. "We get them in these parts all the time." I shook my head vehemently. "It wasn't a bear. I know what I saw. It was a BigFoot," Sheriff Hawkins finished, his tone making it clear how ridiculous he found the idea. "Mr. Thompson, I understand you've been through a traumatic experience. The mind can play tricks on us when we're scared or in shock. "I'm not crazy," I said, hating how defensive I sounded. "And I'm not lying. Josh is out there and he needs our help. Why won't you believe me?" The sheriff sighed, rubbing his temples. "Son, we're doing everything we can to find your friend. But right now the only evidence we have is your story, which, you have to admit, is pretty far-fetched." I slumped in my chair, the fight draining out of me. How could I make them understand? How could I convey the terror of that night, the impossible reality of what I'd seen? "Can I go now?" I asked quietly. "I need to get back out there. I need to find Josh." Sheriff Hawkins shook his head. "I'm afraid I can't let you do that. You're still recovering from your injuries, and we can't risk having another person lost in those woods." "So what, I'm just supposed to sit here and do nothing?" I demanded, anger flaring. "We'll keep you updated on the search," Deputy Martinez said, her voice gentler than the sheriff's. "In the meantime, I suggest you get some rest. There's a motel just down the street." I wanted to argue, to insist on joining the search, but the truth was I was exhausted. My body ached, my ankle throbbed, and my mind felt foggy from lack of sleep and the lingering effects of shock. "Fine," I muttered, pushing myself to my feet. "But this isn't over. I'm not giving up on Josh." As I limped out of the sheriff's office, I could feel their eyes on my back. I didn't need to turn around to know the looks they were exchanging. They thought I was either delusional or a liar. And the worst part was, a small voice in the back of my mind was starting to wonder if they might be right. The motel room was small and shabby, but I barely noticed. I collapsed onto the bed, my body crying out for rest. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the BigFoot's face, heard its bone-chilling roar, felt the terror of that night in the woods. I tossed and turned for hours before finally giving up. Grabbing the remote, I flicked on the ancient TV, hoping for a distraction. Instead, I found myself staring at my own face. "Local man claims his friend was abducted by Bigfoot," the news anchor was saying, her tone somewhere between amusement and skepticism. Matthew Thompson, 28, told authorities that he and his friend Joshua Chen were attacked while camping in the San Juan National Forest. The screen cut to footage of me outside the sheriff's office, looking haggard and wild-eyed. I cringed at the sight. "It was huge," my on-screen self was saying, gesticulating wildly. "At least 8 feet tall, covered in fur. It took Josh. We have to find him." The anchor reappeared, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Local authorities say they are taking Mr. Thompson's claims seriously, but so far have found no evidence to support his story. Search and rescue efforts for Joshua Chen continue." I turned off the TV, my stomach churning. Is that really how I look to everyone else? Like a raving lunatic? A knock at the door startled me out of my spiral of self-doubt. I opened it to find a small group of people, led by a woman whose red-rimmed eyes and drawn face spoke of sleepless nights and endless worry. "Mrs. Chen," I said, recognizing Josh's mother. "Where is he?" she demanded, her voice raw with emotion. "Where's my son, Matt?" I stepped back, allowing them into the room. Josh's father followed, along with his younger sister, Emily. They all looked at me with a mixture of hope and suspicion that made my heart ache. "I don't know," I admitted, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "I've told the police everything. They're searching, but what?" Mr. Chen interrupted. "They said you told them some crazy story about a monster. What really happened out there, Matt?" I looked from face to face, seeing the pain and confusion in their eyes. How could I tell them the truth? How could I expect them to believe what I could hardly believe myself? "It's complicated," I began, but Emily cut me off. "Complicated?" she spat, her eyes flashing with anger. "My brother is missing, possibly dead, and all you can say is it's complicated?" "Emily," Mrs. Chen said softly, placing a hand on her daughter's arm. She turned back to me, her gaze pleading. "Please, Matt. We need to know what happened. The real story. I sank onto the bed, suddenly feeling the weight of everything I'd been through. "You won't believe me," I said quietly. "No one does." "Try us," Mr. Chen said, his voice gruff but not unkind. So I told them. Everything. The attack on our campsite, the chase through the woods, the cave, the impossible creature that had taken Josh. As I spoke, I watched their faces, seeing the same progression I'd seen in everyone else. Confusion, disbelief, and finally, a terrible mixture of pity and suspicion. When I finished, there was a long moment of silence, then Mrs. Chen spoke, her voice trembling. "Matt, are you sure that's what happened? Could you have been confused? Maybe hit your head?" "I know how it sounds," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "But it's the truth. I swear to you, it's the truth." Mr. Chen shook his head slowly. "Son, I've been hiking these mountains for 30 years. There's no such thing as Bigfoot. There has to be another explanation." "Like what?" I demanded, frustration boiling over. "That I did something to Josh? That this is all some sick joke?" "No one's saying that," Mrs. Chen said quickly, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. Emily, who had been silent throughout my story, suddenly stood up. "This is bullshit," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "My brother is out there somewhere, hurt or worse, and you're sitting here telling fairy tales." "Emily," her mother gasped, but the young woman was already storming out of the room. Mr. Chen sighed heavily. "We should go," he said, helping his wife to her feet. "Thank you for talking to us, Matt. We hope you'll let us know if you remember anything else, anything real." The emphasis on the last word was subtle, but it cut deep. They didn't believe me. Of course they didn't. How could they? As the door closed behind them, I felt something inside me break. The tears I'd been holding back for days finally came, hot and bitter. I sobbed until my throat was raw, until I had no more tears left to shed. When I finally regained some semblance of composure, I found myself staring at my reflection in the grimy motel mirror. The face that looked back at me was a stranger's. Haggard, haunted, with eyes that had seen things they couldn't unsee. "What really happened out there?" I whispered to my reflection. "Am I going crazy?" But deep down, I knew the truth. The Bigfoot was real. Josh was out there somewhere, and I was the only one who believed it. The next few days passed in a blur of police interviews, news reporters, and well-meaning but skeptical locals. My story had spread like wildfire, turning me into a local celebrity of the worst kind. Some people treated me with pity, others with barely concealed amusement. A few even approached me eagerly, sharing their own Bigfoot encounters with a zeal that made me uncomfortable. But the worst were the ones who accused me of hoaxing, of playing some sick game for attention. They cornered me in the diner, shouted questions as I walked down the street, left angry messages at the motel. "Where's your proof?" they demanded. "Where's the body? Where's the footage?" I had no answers for them. Just my story, my memories, and the growing fear that maybe, just maybe, I was losing my mind. A week after my escape from the woods, I found myself sitting in Dr. Elena Ramirez's office. The police had insisted I talk to a psychiatrist, thinly veiling their suggestion behind concerns for my mental health. Dr. Ramirez was a kind-faced woman in her 50s with streaks of gray in her dark hair and eyes that seemed to look right through me. "How are you feeling today, Matt?" she asked, her voice gentle. I shrugged, picking at a loose thread on my jeans. "How do you think I'm feeling? My best friend is missing, possibly dead. Everyone thinks I'm either crazy or a liar. And the thing that took Josh is still out there." She nodded, jotting something down in her notepad. "You're under an immense amount of stress. It's natural to feel overwhelmed." "I'm not crazy," I said, the words sounding hollow even to my own ears. "I know what I saw. I'm not here to judge whether what you saw was real or not," Dr. Ramirez said carefully. "I'm here to help you process the trauma you've experienced." "Trauma," I repeated bitterly. "Is that what we're calling it now?" She leaned forward, her eyes kind but probing. Matt, have you considered the possibility that your mind might be protecting you? That perhaps what you remember isn't exactly what happened? I stood up abruptly, anger flaring. Not you too. I thought you were supposed to help me, not tell me I'm delusional. That's not what I'm saying, Dr. Ramirez said calmly. But the mind is complex. Sometimes, when we experience something traumatic, our brains can create explanations that are easier to accept than the reality. Easier? I laughed, the sound harsh and humorless. You think it's easier to believe in Bigfoot than, what? That I did something to Josh? That I left him to die? Of course not, she said quickly. But perhaps there's a middle ground, an explanation that doesn't require believing in cryptids or blaming yourself. I sank back into my chair, suddenly exhausted. Like what? Well, she said gently, you mentioned you and Josh had been drinking that night. Is it possible that an animal, perhaps a bear, attacked your campsite? In the dark, in a state of fear and intoxication, could your mind have interpreted it as something larger? I wanted to argue, to insist that I knew what I'd seen. But doubt, that insidious voice that had been growing louder with each passing day, whispered in the back of my mind. Was it possible? Could I have imagined it all? I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Ramirez nodded encouragingly. It's okay not to have all the answers, Matt. What you've been through is incredibly traumatic. Give yourself time to process it. As I left her office, I felt more lost than ever. The certainty that had driven me for the past week was crumbling, leaving me adrift in a sea of doubt and confusion. I wandered the streets of the small town, barely noticing the curious stares and whispered comments that followed me. My mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. What if they were right? What if I had imagined it all? The alternative, that I had somehow abandoned Josh, left him to die while I saved myself, was almost too horrible to contemplate. My feet carried me to the edge of town, to the trailhead where Josh and I had started our ill-fated hike. Yellow police tape cordoned off the area, fluttering in the breeze like a mocking reminder of everything that had gone wrong. I stared into the depths of the forest, remembering the excitement we'd felt at the start of our trip. How quickly it had turned to terror. I'm sorry, Josh, I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. I'm so sorry. A twig snapped behind me, and I spun around, my heart racing. For a wild moment, I expected to see the Bigfoot, its massive form emerging from the trees. Instead, I found myself face to face with a young woman. She was probably in her early 20s, with long dark hair and eyes that reminded me painfully of Josh's. You're him, aren't you? She asked, her voice tinged with excitement. The Bigfoot guy? I sighed, turning away. Look, I'm not really in the mood for... I believe you, she said quickly. I froze, then slowly turned back to face her. What? She stepped closer, lowering her voice. I believe you, she repeated. About the Bigfoot. I've seen it too. For a moment, hope flared in my chest. Then reality came crashing back. How many believers had approached me over the past week, eager to share their own fantastical stories? Thanks, I said wearily, but I'm not interested in... No, you don't understand, she interrupted, reaching into her bag. I have proof. She pulled out a phone, her fingers flying over the screen. Here, she said, holding it out to me. Look. Reluctantly, I took the phone. On the screen was a blurry photo of a forest. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Then my eyes caught a shape among the trees. A large, dark figure, barely distinguishable from the shadows around it. My heart began to race. When did you take this? I asked, my mouth dry. 3 days ago, she said, her eyes shining with excitement. About 10 miles north of where you were camping. I was hiking and I saw... something. I only managed to get one picture before it disappeared. I stared at the photo, my mind reeling. It wasn't clear. It could have been anything. A bear, a shadow, a trick of the light, but something about it sent a chill down my spine. "I'm Lily, by the way," the young woman said, holding out her hand. "Lily Hawkins." I shook it absently, still staring at the phone. "Hawkins? Any relation to Sheriff Hawkins?" She nodded, a wry smile on her face. "He's my uncle. And before you ask, no, he doesn't believe me either. Says I've been reading too many cryptid forums online." I handed the phone back to her, my thoughts in turmoil. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll help me," Lily said eagerly. "We can find it together. Prove to everyone that we're not crazy." I looked at her, saw the hope and determination in her eyes. It was like looking at a reflection of myself from a week ago, before doubt and disbelief had worn me down. "I can't," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "I'm sorry, but I just can't." Her face fell. But you saw it. You know it's real." "Do I?" I asked, more to myself than to her. "I don't know what I saw anymore. Maybe they're right. Maybe it was all in my head." "No," Lily said firmly, grabbing my arm. "Don't let them convince you of that. You know what you saw. Deep down, you know the truth." Days blur together as I assist in the search, hoping for any sign of Josh. The relentless sun beats down on the search party as we comb through the dense underbrush of the San Juan wilderness. My eyes strain, desperately seeking any hint of my friend's presence, a scrap of clothing, a footprint, anything to prove that Josh is still out there. "Mike, over here!" a voice calls out. My heart leaps into my throat as I scramble towards the sound, ignoring the thorns that tear at my clothes. I burst into a small clearing where Deputy Rodriguez stands, his face grim. "What is it? Did you find something?" I ask, breathless with anticipation. The deputy holds up a tattered piece of fabric. "Is this from Josh's shirt?" My hopes crash as I examine the scrap. "No," I say, my voice hollow. "It's just some old trash." Rodriguez sighs, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "We'll keep looking, Mike. We're not giving up." I nod, but the words ring hollow. We've been searching for days, and with each passing hour, the chances of finding Josh alive grow slimmer. As the search continues, I can't shake the feeling that we're being watched. The forest seems to close in around us, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sets my nerves on edge. "You okay, Mike?" asks Sarah, one of the volunteer searchers. Her concerned gaze makes me realize I've been staring off into the woods, lost in thought. I force a weak smile. "Yeah, just worried about Josh." Sarah squeezes my shoulder reassuringly. "We'll find him. Try to stay positive." But how can I stay positive when I know what's really out there? The image of that massive, hair-covered creature dragging Josh into the darkness flashes through my mind for the 100th time. I want to tell them all the truth, to warn them of the danger, but I know they won't believe me. They'd think I was crazy, or worse, that I had something to do with Josh's disappearance. As the day wears on, the search becomes more desperate. We push further into uncharted territory, areas so remote that even the most experienced rangers rarely venture there. The terrain grows more treacherous, with steep ravines and dense thickets that seem designed to conceal secrets. "We should turn back," one of the rangers says as the light begins to fade. "It's not safe to be out here after dark." Part of me wants to argue, to insist that we keep searching, but I know he's right. The memory of that night, of the creature's glowing eyes and bone-chilling roar, is still too fresh. "We'll resume at first light," Deputy Rodriguez announces. "Everyone stay close on the way back. It's easy to get turned around out here." As we make our way back to base camp, I can't shake the feeling that we're being herded, like prey being guided away from a predator's lair. Every shadow seems to move, every distant sound a potential threat. Back at camp, I collapse onto my cot, exhaustion finally overtaking me. But sleep brings no relief. Only vivid nightmares of Josh's final moments, his screams echoing in my ears. I wake with a start, drenched in cold sweat. The digital clock on my phone reads 3:27 a.m. The camp is quiet, save for the gentle snoring of the other searchers. Unable to face the prospect of more nightmares, I step outside, hoping the cool night air will clear my head. The moon hangs low and full, casting an eerie glow over the campsite. I walk to the edge of the clearing, staring out into the dark forest. Somewhere out there, Josh is waiting to be found. Or his body is, a traitorous voice in my head whispers. A twig snaps in the darkness, and I freeze. My heart pounds in my chest as I strain my eyes, trying to penetrate the inky blackness between the trees. Is it just my imagination, or is that a shape moving out there just beyond the reach of the moonlight? "Hello?" I call out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is someone there?" Silence answers me, but the feeling of being watched intensifies. I back away slowly, never taking my eyes off the tree line. Just as I'm about to turn and run back to my tent, a low, rumbling growl reaches my ears. It's so deep I feel it more than hear it, a primal sound that sends shivers down my spine. I sprint back to my tent, zipping it shut behind me as if the thin fabric could offer any protection against the horrors lurking in the woods. Sleep eludes me for the rest of the night, my mind racing with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. The next morning, I debate whether to tell the others about what I heard. In the harsh light of day, it seems almost ridiculous. But the fear I felt was real, and I can't shake the certainty that something is out there, watching and waiting. As we gear up for another day of searching, I pull Deputy Rodriguez aside. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" I ask, my voice low. He nods, concern evident in his eyes. "What's on your mind, Mike?" I take a deep breath, steeling myself. I know this is going to sound crazy, but I don't think we're alone out here. Rodriguez's brow furrows. "What do you mean?" "Last night, I heard something in the woods. Something big. And I've had this feeling like we're being watched ever since we started the search." The deputy studies me for a long moment. "Mike, I know you're under a lot of stress right now. It's natural to be jumpy after what you've been through. But I promise you, there's nothing out there but trees and animals." I shake my head, frustration building. "You don't understand. This wasn't just an animal, it was something else." "Like what?" Rodriguez asks, his tone growing skeptical. I hesitate, knowing how insane it will sound. "Like BigFoot." The deputy's expression shifts from concern to disbelief. "Bigfoot? Mike, come on. You can't seriously believe that." "I know what I saw that night," I insist, my voice rising. "It was huge, covered in hair. It took Josh right out of his tent." Rodriguez holds up his hands placatingly. Okay. Let's just take a step back here. I know you're worried about Josh. We all are. But let's focus on the search, all right? We need to keep a clear head if we're going to find him." I want to argue further, to make him understand the danger we're all in, but I can see it's useless. The deputies already dismissed me as traumatized and irrational. With a resigned nod, I turn away, my shoulders slumping in defeat. As we head out for another day of searching, I can't help but feel like we're walking into a trap. Every step takes us deeper into the creature's territory, and I'm powerless to stop it. The day drags on, each hour blending into the next as we systematically comb through the wilderness. The oppressive heat and the constant buzz of insects wear on everyone's nerves, tempers fraying as exhaustion sets in. "This is pointless," one of the volunteers grumbles as we pause for a water break. "If he was out here, we would have found him by now." "We can't give up," Sarah insists, though I can hear the fatigue in her voice. "Josh is counting on us." I stay silent, caught between hope and despair. Part of me wants to believe that Josh is still alive, waiting to be rescued. But the rational part of my mind knows the odds, knows what that creature is capable of. As we prepare to move on, a shout rings out from further up the trail. "Hey, I think I found something." We rush towards the voice, hope surging anew. A young ranger named Tim is crouched by a large boulder examining something on the ground. "What is it?" Rodriguez asks as we gather around. Tim points to a dark smear on the rock face. "It looks like blood. And look here." He gestures to the ground, where a set of large, misshapen footprints lead away from the boulder. My breath catches in my throat as I stare at the prints. They're exactly like the ones I saw that night, massive and inhuman. "Those aren't human tracks," one of the other rangers says, voicing what we're all thinking. Rodriguez kneels to examine the prints more closely. "Could be a bear," he suggests, but I can hear the uncertainty in his voice. "That's no bear print," I say, my voice shaking. It's what I told you about. The creature that took Josh." The group falls silent, the tension palpable. I can see the doubt in their eyes, the reluctance to believe in something so outside their understanding of the world. "Let's not jump to conclusions," Rodriguez says finally. "We'll take some samples, make a cast of the print. For now, let's follow the trail and see where it leads." As we set off after the tracks, I can't shake the feeling that we're walking into the lion's den. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every shadow between the trees could be hiding the creature, waiting to strike. The trail leads us deeper into the wilderness to areas so remote they don't even appear on our maps. The terrain grows more challenging, forcing us to climb over fallen trees and navigate treacherous ravines. "We should turn back," one of the rangers says as we pause to catch our breath. "We're way outside our search grid now." Rodriguez looks torn, glancing between the continuing trail of prints and the anxious faces of the search party. "We can't just ignore this lead," he says, "but I don't want to put anyone at unnecessary risk. I'll continue on with a small team. The rest of you head back to base camp and report our position." "I'm coming with you," I say immediately. There's no way I'm turning back now, not when we might finally be close to answers. In the end, our group is whittled down to 5: Rodriguez, Tim, Sarah, myself, and a seasoned ranger named Jack. The others reluctantly head back, leaving us to press on into the unknown. As we continue to follow the trail, the forest around us seems to change. The trees grow more gnarled and ancient, their branches twisting together overhead to block out much of the sunlight. An oppressive silence falls, broken only by our labored breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. "Does anyone else feel like we're being watched?" Sarah whispers, her eyes darting nervously from tree to tree. I nod, grateful that someone else senses it too. "It's been like this since we started the search," I tell her. "Like something's out there, just waiting for the right moment." "Cut the ghost stories," Jack grumbles. But I notice his hand straying to the hunting knife on his belt. The trail leads us to the base of a steep hill where the prints suddenly vanish. We spread out, searching for any sign of where they might continue. "Over here," Tim calls out. "I think I found a cave entrance." We gather around a narrow opening partially hidden by dense foliage. The musty smell of decay wafts from the darkness, making my stomach churn. Rodriguez shines his flashlight into the cave, revealing a narrow passage that curves out of sight. "This could be an animal den," he says. "We should proceed with caution, or it could be that thing's lair," I say, unable to keep the fear from my voice. The deputy gives me a stern look. "Mike, I know you're convinced about this Bigfoot theory, but we need to stay rational here. We're looking for Josh, nothing else. Understood?" I nod reluctantly, knowing that arguing will only make me seem more unhinged. We enter the cave, single file, Rodriguez in the lead with his flashlight, Jack bringing up the rear. The passage is narrow and winding, forcing us to duck and squeeze through in places. The air grows thicker as we descend, heavy with the stench of rotting vegetation and something else, something worse. After what feels like an eternity of claustrophobic darkness, the passage opens into a larger chamber. Rodriguez's flashlight beam sweeps across the space, revealing a scene straight out of a nightmare. The walls are covered in claw marks, deep gouges in the stone that no normal animal could have made. Piles of bones litter the floor, some clearly animal, others disturbingly human-like. And there, in the center of it all, is a nest of sorts, made from branches, and what looks horribly like scraps of clothing. "Oh my God," Sarah gasps, her hand flying to her mouth. I step forward, my heart pounding. Among the debris in the nest, something catches my eye. I reach down with trembling hands and pull out a torn, blood-stained backpack. Josh's backpack. "It's Josh's," I say, my voice cracking. This is where it brought him." The others gather around, their faces pale in the harsh glare of the flashlights. Even Rodriguez looks shaken, his earlier skepticism crumbling in the face of this grisly evidence. What could have done this?" Tim asks, his voice barely above a whisper. Before anyone can answer, a low, rumbling growl echoes through the chamber. We spin around, flashlights dancing wildly across the walls, trying to locate the source of the sound. "We need to get out of here," Jack says urgently. "Now." But as we turn to flee, we find our exit blocked. There, filling the passage with its massive bulk, stands the creature from my nightmares. The BigFoot. Its eyes glow with an unholy light, reflecting our flashlight beams back at us. Matted fur caked with dirt and what can only be blood covers its enormous frame. As it opens its mouth, revealing rows of sharp teeth, an overwhelming stench of decay washes over us. Sarah screams, the sound echoing off the cave walls. The creature roars in response, the primal sound shaking dust and small stones from the ceiling. "Run!" Rodriguez shouts, drawing his service pistol. We scatter, trying to find another way out of the chamber. But the BigFoot is impossibly fast for its size. With one swipe of its massive arm, it sends Jack flying across the cave. He hits the wall with a sickening crunch and crumples to the ground unmoving. I hear gunshots as Rodriguez opens fire, the muzzle flashes briefly illuminating the chamber in strobe-like bursts. The bullets seem to have little effect on the creature, serving only to enrage it further. "This way!" Tim yells, having found a small opening on the far side of the chamber. Sarah and I rush towards him, but Rodriguez stands his ground, emptying his clip into the advancing monster. "Deputy, come on!" I shout, but it's too late. The BigFoot closes the distance in 2 massive strides. I watch in horror as it grabs Rodriguez, lifting him off the ground as if he weighs nothing. The deputy's scream is cut short as the creature sinks its teeth into his throat. Sarah pulls me towards the opening. "We have to go. Now." Tears blurring my vision, I follow her and Tim into the narrow passage. The sound of snapping bones and tearing flesh follows us, along with the BigFoot's triumphant roar. We stumble through the darkness, scraping against rough stone walls as we flee deeper into the cave system. Behind us, we can hear the creature giving chase, its growls growing louder as it gains on us. "There!" Tim gasps, pointing ahead. A faint glimmer of daylight shines through a small opening. We push ourselves harder, desperation lending us speed. The passage narrows further, forcing us to crawl on our hands and knees. I can feel the BigFoot's hot breath on my legs as we squirm towards freedom. Just as I think it's going to grab me, I tumble out of the opening, rolling down a steep embankment. We scramble to our feet, not daring to look back as we sprint through the forest. Branches whip at our faces, roots threaten to trip us, but sheer terror keeps us moving. The creature's roars fade behind us, but we don't slow down until our lungs are burning and our legs feel like jelly. Finally, we collapse in a small clearing, gasping for air. As the adrenaline fades, the full horror of what we've just experienced crashes over us. Sarah breaks down in sobs while Tim stares blankly into the distance, his eyes wide with shock. I pull out my phone with shaking hands, desperate to call for help. But there's no signal. We're miles from anywhere, lost in a wilderness that's far more dangerous than we ever imagined. As the sun begins to set, casting long shadows through the trees, a grim reality sets in. We're not the searchers anymore. We're the survivors, and our ordeal is far from over. "What do we do now?" Sarah asks, her voice hoarse from crying. I look at my shell-shocked companions, then back at the darkening forest. Somewhere out there, the BigFoot is waiting. The scream tore from Sarah's throat, raw and primal, echoing through the dense pine forest of the San Juan Mountains. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the damp earth, fingers digging into the soil where Josh had last stood. The memories flooded back, vivid and visceral, as if it had happened only yesterday instead of 3 months ago. Sarah's body shook with sobs, her tears mingling with the earthy scent of decaying leaves. "Why?" she choked out between gasps. "Why did it have to be you, Josh?" As her cries subsided, Sarah became acutely aware of the oppressive silence surrounding her. The forest seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to happen. She slowly raised her head, eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Nothing. With trembling hands, Sarah reached into her backpack and pulled out her journal. She'd been meticulously documenting every detail she could remember about that fateful night, along with her subsequent research into Bigfoot sightings. The pages were filled with frantic scribbles, newspaper clippings, and printouts from obscure cryptozoology websites. "I know what I saw," Sarah muttered to herself as she flipped through the pages. It was real. It had to be real. But doubt gnawed at the edges of her consciousness. The lack of physical evidence, the skepticism of authorities, and the pitying looks from friends and family had all taken their toll. Sarah found herself questioning her own memories, wondering if grief and trauma had warped her perception of events. A twig snapped somewhere in the forest, causing Sarah to jump to her feet, heart racing. "Hello?" she called out, voice wavering. "Is anyone there?" Silence answered her. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. She knew coming back here was a risk, but she couldn't stay away. The need for answers, for some kind of closure, had become all-consuming. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, Sarah reluctantly packed up her belongings. She couldn't stay in the woods overnight, not alone. The drive back to her rented cabin was tense, every shadow on the winding mountain road seeming to take on monstrous shapes in her peripheral vision. Once inside the small rustic cabin, Sarah locked the door and drew the curtains. She lit a fire in the ancient wood stove, seeking comfort in its warm glow. As she settled onto the worn couch, her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from her sister, Karen. "How are you holding up? Please come home soon. We're worried about you." Sarah sighed, guilt mingling with frustration. She knew her family meant well, but they couldn't understand what she was going through. How could they when she barely understood it herself? She typed out a quick reply. "I'm fine. Just need a few more days. Don't worry." Setting the phone aside, Sarah reached for her laptop. She'd developed a nightly routine of scouring the internet for any new information on Bigfoot sightings or unexplained disappearances in the area. Most of what she found was clearly hoaxes or easily debunked, but occasionally she'd come across something that made her pulse quicken with possibility. Hours passed as Sarah fell down one rabbit hole after another. Her eyes burned from staring at the screen, but she couldn't bring herself to stop. Just one more page, one more forum thread, one more blurry photo that might hold the key to validating her experience. A loud knock at the cabin door startled Sarah out of her research trance. She glanced at the clock. 2:17 a.m. Who could be here at this hour? Heart-pounding, Sarah approached the door. "Who's there?" she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. "Park ranger," a gruff male voice replied. "Sorry to bother you so late, ma'am, but we've had reports of unusual activity in the area. Mind if I come in for a moment?" Sarah hesitated, her hand on the doorknob. Something about the situation felt off, but she couldn't put her finger on why. Maybe it was just her paranoia talking. "Can I see some ID?" she asked. There was a pause, then the sound of rustling fabric. "Of course," the voice said. "I'll slide it under the door." Sarah knelt down, watching as a small rectangle of plastic appeared in the gap beneath the door. She picked it up, examining it closely in the dim light. The ID looked official enough, with the logo of the U.S. Forest Service and a photo of a middle-aged man with a bushy mustache. Still uneasy, Sarah opened the door a crack, chain lock still in place. The man on the porch matched the photo on the ID, his ranger uniform neat and pressed despite the late hour. What kind of unusual activity? Sarah asked, curiosity overriding her caution. The ranger's expression turned grave. We've had several reports of large, unidentified animals in the area. Campers hearing strange noises, finding unusual tracks. Given recent events, we're taking all reports seriously. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Recent events? She echoed. You mean Josh Thompson? The ranger nodded solemnly. Among others. There's been a spike in missing persons cases in these mountains over the past few months. We're just trying to keep everyone safe. Sarah's mind raced. This could be the break she'd been waiting for. Someone in an official capacity, taking the possibility of BigFoot seriously. I was there that night, Sarah blurted out. With Josh. I saw what happened. The ranger's eyebrows shot up. You were? Ma'am, I'm going to need you to let me in so we can discuss this further. This could be vital information for our investigation. Sarah hesitated, her earlier unease returning. Something still felt off about the situation, but the prospect of finally being heard, of having her story taken seriously, was too tempting to resist. She closed the door, unlatched the chain, and opened it wide. Come in, she said. I'll tell you everything I know. The ranger stepped inside, his boots leaving muddy prints on the cabin's wooden floor. Sarah led him to the small living area, gesturing for him to take a seat while she perched nervously on the edge of the couch. Start from the beginning, the ranger said, pulling out a small notebook. Don't leave out any details, no matter how insignificant they might seem. Sarah took a deep breath and began recounting the events of that terrible night. She described the camping trip, the strange noises they'd heard, and the massive hair-covered creature that had emerged from the darkness. Her voice shook as she recalled Josh's final moments, the sickening crunch of bones, and the inhuman roar that still haunted her dreams. The ranger listened intently, jotting down notes and occasionally asking for clarification. When Sarah finished her story, he sat back, a thoughtful expression on his face. That's quite a tale, Ms. Lawson, he said slowly. I have to admit it matches up with some of the other reports we've received. Sarah leaned forward eagerly. So you believe me? You think it could really be, BigFoot? The ranger's expression turned serious. I'm not at liberty to speculate on the nature of these incidents, but I can tell you that we're taking all possibilities very seriously. He stood up, tucking his notebook away. Thank you for your time, Ms. Lawson. This information will be extremely helpful in our ongoing investigation. As the ranger moved towards the door, Sarah felt a surge of panic. She couldn't let this opportunity slip away. Wait, she called out. Is there anything else I can do to help? Any way I can be involved in the investigation? The ranger paused, turning back to face her. I'm afraid not, ma'am. This is a sensitive matter and we need to keep civilian involvement to a minimum. For your own safety, I'd strongly advise you to leave the area as soon as possible. We can't guarantee the security of isolated cabins like this one. Sarah's heart sank. But I can't leave, she protested. Not until I find answers. Not until I know for sure what happened to Josh. The ranger's expression softened slightly. I understand your need for closure, Ms. Lawson, but trust me when I say that the best thing you can do right now is to go home and try to move on with your life. Let us handle the investigation. With that, he opened the door and stepped out into the night. Sarah watched from the window as he climbed into a Forest Service truck and drove away, the red taillights soon swallowed by the darkness. Sleep eluded Sarah that night. Her mind raced with the implications of the ranger's visit. On one hand, it seemed to validate her experiences. Clearly, something strange was happening in these mountains. But on the other hand, being told to leave felt like giving up, like abandoning Josh's memory. As dawn broke, Sarah made a decision. She couldn't walk away, not now. If the authorities wouldn't let her help officially, she'd continue her own investigation. She was close to something. She could feel it. Sarah spent the next few days combing through the surrounding forest, searching for any signs of unusual activity. She set up trail cameras at strategic points, hoping to capture evidence of the creature's existence. Each night, She pored over the footage, heart pounding every time a shadow moved across the frame. But as the days wore on with no concrete results, doubt began to creep back in. What if she was chasing shadows? What if her grief-stricken mind had conjured up a monster to explain the inexplicable loss of Josh? On the 5th day of her self-imposed mission, Sarah's phone rang. It was Karen again. "Sarah, please." Her sister's voice was thick with worry. "It's been almost 2 weeks. Mom and Dad are beside themselves. We all miss Josh, but this isn't healthy." Sarah closed her eyes, fighting back tears. "You don't understand, Karen. I can't just let this go. I need to know the truth." "The truth?" Karen's voice took on an edge of frustration. "Sarah, the truth is that Josh had an accident in dangerous terrain. It's tragic, it's unfair, but it happens. This BigFoot obsession, it's not bringing him back. It's just keeping you from moving forward." "You weren't there," Sarah snapped. "You didn't see what I saw." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Karen spoke again, her voice was gentle but firm. "No, I wasn't there, and I can't imagine how traumatic that must have been for you. But Sarah, have you considered that maybe what you think you saw wasn't real? That maybe your mind is trying to make sense of something senseless?" Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. "Are you saying I'm crazy?" "No, of course not." Karen quickly backpedaled. "I'm just worried about you. We all are. Dr. Ramirez says it's not uncommon for people who've experienced trauma to—" "You talked to my therapist?" Sarah interrupted, anger flaring. "How dare you?" "We're trying to help you, Sarah," Karen pleaded. "Please, just come home. We can work through this together." Sarah ended the call without another word, throwing her phone onto the couch in frustration. She paced the small cabin, emotions warring within her. Part of her knew that Karen had a point. This obsession wasn't healthy, but the thought of giving up, of accepting that she'd never know the truth about what happened to Josh, was unbearable. As night fell, Sarah found herself once again in the forest, checking her trail cameras. The familiar routine was comforting, giving her a sense of purpose amidst the chaos of her thoughts. She was retrieving the memory card from the last camera when a twig snapped behind her. Sarah whirled around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Hello?" she called out, voice trembling. "Is someone there?" Silence answered her, broken only by the gentle rustle of leaves in the night breeze. Sarah was about to turn back to the trail camera when she noticed something odd about the tree line ahead of her. One of the shadows seemed wrong. Darker than the others, with an unnatural stillness that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the shadow began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it separated itself from the tree line, revealing a massive, hulking form. Time seemed to stand still as Sarah found herself face to face with the creature that had haunted her nightmares for months. It was just as she remembered. Over 8 feet tall, covered in thick matted fur with eyes that gleamed with an unsettling intelligence. Sarah's body screamed at her to run, but she remained rooted to the spot, unable to look away. The creature tilted its head, regarding her with what almost seemed like curiosity. Then, to Sarah's utter shock, it spoke. The voice was deep and guttural, barely recognizable as speech, but the words were unmistakable. "Why? You here?" Sarah's mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. BigFoot was real, and it could talk? She struggled to form a coherent response. I'm looking for answers," she finally managed to stammer out. "About my friend. About what happened that night." The creature's eyes narrowed, a low rumble emanating from its chest. "Dangerous," it growled. "You not belong." Sarah felt a surge of anger, temporarily overriding her fear. "I have every right to be here," she shot back. "You took someone I cared about. I deserve to know why." The creature recoiled slightly, as if taken aback by her outburst. It was silent for a long moment, its massive form swaying slightly in the moonlight. When it spoke again, there was a note of what almost sounded like regret in its voice. "Not Take. Protect. Sarah's brow furrowed in confusion. Protect? What do you mean? But before the creature could respond, a new sound cut through the night, the distant rumble of an engine growing closer. The creature's head snapped towards the sound, its body tensing. Danger, it growled. You. Go. Now. With that, it turned and loped back into the forest, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. Sarah stood frozen, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. The sound of the approaching vehicle snapped her back to reality. She quickly gathered her equipment and hurried back towards her cabin, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. As she burst through the cabin door, Sarah's eyes fell on her laptop, still open to the dozens of browser tabs filled with Bigfoot research. Everything she thought she knew had just been turned on its head. The creature was real. It could communicate. And it claimed it hadn't killed Josh but protected him? From what? Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard as she started a new document, desperate to record every detail of her encounter while it was still fresh in her mind. She had proof now. Real, irrefutable proof that she wasn't crazy, that something extraordinary was happening in these mountains. But as the adrenaline began to wear off, a new fear took hold. The creature had warned of danger, had told her to leave, and now there was a vehicle approaching in the middle of the night. Sarah's mind flashed back to the visit from the park ranger. Had that been legitimate, or was something more sinister at play? A heavy knock at the door made Sarah jump. She approached cautiously, peering through the peephole. Two men in dark suits stood on the porch, their expressions grim. One held up a badge, but Sarah couldn't make out the details in the dim light. "Ms. Lawson?" One of the men called out. "We need to speak with you. It's a matter of national security." Sarah's heart raced. National security? What did that have to do with Bigfoot? "Who are you?" She called back, keeping her voice as steady as possible. "We're with a specialized branch of the government," the man replied. "We have some questions about your recent activities in this area. Please open the door." Sarah's mind raced. If she opened the door, she might finally get some answers. But her encounter with the creature had shaken her certainty about everything. What if these men weren't who they claimed to be? "I'm sorry," Sarah said, backing away from the door. "I'm not comfortable opening the door this late at night. If you'd like to speak with me, we can arrange a meeting tomorrow at a public location." There was a moment of tense silence, then the sound of hushed conversation between the two men. "Ms. Lawson?" The first man's voice took on a harder edge. "I'm afraid we don't have time for that. We have reason to believe you've been in contact with a highly dangerous entity. For your own safety and the safety of others, we need you to come with us now." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. They knew about the creature. But how? And what did they mean by highly dangerous? "I don't understand," Sarah called out, buying time as she frantically looked around the cabin for an escape route. "What entity? What's going on?" "Open the door, Ms. Lawson." The second man spoke for the first time, his voice cold and authoritative. "Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." The incessant ticking of the clock on my nightstand seemed to mock me as I lay awake staring at the ceiling. Another sleepless night. Another reminder of that fateful expedition into the mountains 5 years ago. I rolled over, burying my face in the pillow, but it was no use. Sleep wouldn't come. With a resigned sigh, I threw off the covers and padded barefoot to the kitchen. The linoleum was cold against my feet, a stark contrast to the warmth of my bed. But I knew from experience that warmth offered no comfort, not anymore. As I filled the kettle, my eyes drifted to the window. The full moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across my backyard. For a moment, I thought I saw something move at the edge of the tree line. My heart rate spiked and I nearly dropped the kettle. "Get a grip, Sarah," I muttered to myself. "It's just the wind." But even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. The trees stood perfectly still, not a leaf rustling in the quiet night. Whatever I'd seen, or thought I'd seen, It wasn't the wind. I set the kettle on the stove with trembling hands and reached for my phone. My finger hovered over Jack's number for a long moment before I set it back down. What would I even say? "Hey Jack, remember that thing we saw 5 years ago that ruined both our lives? Well, I think it might be in my backyard." No, I couldn't do that to him. Not again. The whistle of the kettle made me jump, and I quickly took it off the heat. As I poured the steaming water over a tea bag, I tried to calm my racing thoughts. It had been years since I'd seen anything that made me think of that night. I'd convinced myself it was all behind me, that I could move on, live a normal life. But deep down, I'd always known the truth. You don't just move on from something like that. I carried my tea to the living room, settling into my favorite armchair. The leather was cool against my skin, and I pulled my robe tighter around me. My eyes kept drifting to the window, searching the darkness for any sign of movement. "You're being ridiculous," I told myself firmly. "There's nothing out there." But even as I said it, a chill ran down my spine, because I knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that I was lying to myself. There was something out there. There always had been. I took a sip of my tea, wincing as it burned my tongue. The pain was a welcome distraction from the memories that threatened to overwhelm me. Memories of that night in the mountains, of the thing we'd seen, the thing that had changed everything. My gaze fell on the bookshelf across the room, where a dusty photo album sat untouched. I hadn't looked at those pictures in years, couldn't bear to see the faces of my friends, of Jack, before everything fell apart. But tonight something compelled me to stand up, to cross the room on unsteady legs. I pulled the album from the shelf, my fingers leaving trails in the dust. For a long moment I just stood there, holding it, feeling the weight of it in my hands. Then, slowly, I opened it. The first picture hit me like a physical blow. There we were, the 5 of us, standing at the trailhead. Our faces were bright with excitement, our backpacks laden with supplies for what we thought would be the adventure of a lifetime. If only we'd known. I traced my finger over Jack's face, remembering the way he'd looked at me that day. The way he'd never looked at me again after what happened. A sound from outside made me freeze. It was faint, barely audible but unmistakable. A twig snapping as if under a heavy footfall. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly turned toward the window. There, at the edge of the yard, was a shadow. Darker than the surrounding night, it stood perfectly still, watching, waiting. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but I was frozen in place, the photo album clutched to my chest like a shield. As I stared, unable to look away, the shadow moved. Just a slight shift, but enough to confirm my worst fears. It wasn't my imagination. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was real. And it was here. The realization hit me like a bucket of ice water. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet in my haste to get away from the window. The photo album fell from my hands, pictures scattering across the floor like fallen leaves. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers shaking so badly I could barely dial. It rang once, twice, 3 times before a groggy voice answered. "Hello?" "Jack," I gasped, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's here. It found me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Jack spoke again, his voice was tight with tension. "Sarah, what are you talking about? What's there?" I swallowed hard, forcing myself to say the words I'd avoided for 5 long years. "The BigFoot, Jack. It's outside my house." Another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear the conflict in Jack's mind, the battle between disbelief and the memory of what we'd seen that night. "Sarah," he said finally, his voice gentle. "We've been over this. What we saw that night. It wasn't real. It couldn't have been." "Don't!" I hissed, anger momentarily overriding my fear. "Don't you dare try to gaslight me, Jack. You were there, you saw it too." I saw Something, Jack admitted reluctantly. But it was dark. We were scared and exhausted. Our minds were playing tricks on us. It's the only explanation that makes sense. I wanted to scream at him, to shake him through the phone until he remembered the truth. But I knew it was useless. Jack had made his choice years ago, had decided that denial was easier than living with the truth. Fine, I said, my voice cold. Believe what you want, but I'm telling you it's here. And I don't know what to do. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Jack spoke again, his voice was different, hesitant, afraid. Sarah, are you sure? I mean, absolutely sure? I glanced back at the window, my breath catching in my throat. The shadow was still there, but it had moved closer. Much closer. Yes, I whispered. I'm sure. Jack's breath hissed through the phone. Okay. Listen to me. Don't do anything. Don't go outside. I'm coming over. Relief flooded through me, so intense it made me dizzy. You believe me? I don't know what I believe, Jack admitted, but I'm not letting you face this alone. Not again. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Just be careful, okay? Okay, I said, my voice small. Please hurry. I ended the call and sank to the floor, my back against the wall. 20 minutes. I just had to hold on for 20 minutes. I could do that. I had to do that. A low, rumbling growl from outside made me flinch. It was a sound I'd heard only once before, on that terrible night 5 years ago. A sound that had haunted my nightmares ever since. It's not real, I whispered to myself, echoing Jack's words. It can't be real. But even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. The BigFoot was real. It was here. And after 5 long years, it had finally found me. The next 20 minutes were the longest of my life. I sat there on the floor, my eyes fixed on the window, waiting, watching. The shadow outside remained motionless, but I could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive, pressing in on me from all sides. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside, sent a fresh jolt of terror through me. I wanted to run, to hide, to do something, but I knew with a certainty that went beyond logic, that if I moved, if I tried to escape, it would be on me in an instant. So I sat, and I waited, and I prayed that Jack would arrive before it was too late. When headlights finally swept across the yard, I nearly cried with relief. The shadow at the edge of the trees seemed to melt away, disappearing into the darkness as if it had never been there at all. I scrambled to my feet, my legs stiff and painful from sitting in one position for so long. By the time I reached the front door, Jack was already there, his fist raised to knock. I threw the door open and practically fell into his arms. He caught me, his embrace warm and solid and real. For a moment, I let myself believe that everything would be okay, that Jack's presence alone could banish the horrors that lurked in the night. Sarah, Jack said, his voice low and urgent. Are you all right? Did you see it again? I pulled back, searching his face. There was concern there, and fear, but also a hint of skepticism that made my heart sink. It was here, I insisted, right outside watching me. I swear, Jack, I'm not making this up. Jack's expression softened. I know you're not, Sarah. Let's go inside, okay? We can talk about this properly. I nodded, stepping back to let him in. As Jack closed the door behind him, I couldn't help but glance out into the darkness one last time. The yard was empty, the trees still, but I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that it was still out there, watching, waiting. Jack followed my gaze, his brow furrowed. Do you see something? I shook my head. Not anymore. But it was there, Jack, I swear it was. He placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, steering me away from the door. Come on, let's sit down and you can tell me everything. We moved to the living room where my forgotten cup of tea sat cold on the coffee table. Jack's eyes fell on the scattered photos on the floor, and he bent to pick one up. I haven't seen these in years, he murmured, studying the image. It was a picture of the two of us taken just before the expedition. We were smiling, our arms around each other, blissfully unaware of the horror that awaited us. I couldn't bear to look at them, I admitted. Not after everything. Jack set the photo down, his expression unreadable. Sarah, about that night, don't, I cut him off. Don't try to explain it away again. I know what I saw, Jack, what we saw. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'm not trying to explain it away, I don't know how to reconcile what happened with what I know to be possible. It doesn't make sense. None of it makes sense, I said, my voice rising. But that doesn't make it any less real. It was out there tonight, Jack. Just like it was 5 years ago. And I'm terrified that it's not going to stop until... I trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Jack reached out, taking my hand in his. Until what, Sarah? I looked up at him, fear and determination warring in my chest. Until it finishes what it started that night. Jack's grip on my hand tightened. Nothing is going to happen to you, I won't let it. I wanted to believe him. God, how I wanted to believe him. But the memory of that night, of the creature's inhuman strength and speed, was too vivid. You can't stop it, Jack, none of us can. That's what I've been trying to tell you all these years. It's not just some animal, it's something else. Something more. Jack was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing absent patterns on the back of my hand. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with resignation. Okay. Let's say, for argument's sake, that you're right. That what we saw that night was real and that it's back now. What do we do? How do we fight something like that? I shook my head, feeling helpless. I don't know. I've been asking myself that question for 5 years and I still don't have an answer. Jack stood up suddenly, pacing the length of the living room. There has to be something. Some way to protect ourselves, to fight back. With what? I asked. Guns? Traps? You saw how easily it tore through our camp that night. Nothing we have could stop it. Jack stopped pacing, turning to face me. There was a determined set to his jaw that I remembered from our days in college, when he'd set his mind to a particularly challenging project. Maybe not, he said slowly, but maybe we don't need to stop it. Maybe we just need to understand it. I stared at him, not comprehending. What do you mean? He began to pace again, his words coming faster now. Think about it, Sarah. If this thing is real, really real, then it's been out there all this time. Hiding. Surviving. There must be a reason it's showing itself now after all these years. To finish what it started, I said, repeating my earlier fear. But Jack shook his head. I don't think so. If it wanted to hurt you, it could have done it tonight. But it didn't. It just watched. Why? I hadn't considered that. In my fear, I'd assumed the worst. But Jack was right. If the creature had wanted to attack, it had every opportunity. I don't know, I admitted. What are you thinking? Jack sat down next to me again, his eyes bright with a mixture of fear and excitement. I'm thinking that maybe, just maybe, it's trying to communicate. The idea was so absurd that I almost laughed. Communicate? Jack, this thing nearly killed us. It's not some misunderstood gentle giant. It's dangerous. Of course it is, Jack agreed. But so are a lot of animals. That doesn't mean they're not intelligent, that they don't have their own ways of communicating. I shook my head, unable to wrap my mind around what he was suggesting. Even if you're right, what difference does it make? How does understanding it help us? Jack leaned forward, his voice intense. Because if we can understand it, maybe we can find a way to coexist. To end this standoff. Don't you see, Sarah? This could be our chance to finally put that night behind us. To find some kind of peace. I wanted to believe him. Part of me, the part that had never stopped hoping for a resolution to the nightmare of the past 5 years, desperately wanted to embrace his theory. But the memory of that night, of the terror and the violence, was too strong. And if you're wrong? I asked quietly. If it's not trying to communicate? If it's just waiting for the right moment to strike? Jack's face fell, the excitement in his eyes dimming. Then we'll deal with that when the time comes. But Sarah, we have to try. We can't keep living like this, jumping at shadows and letting fear control our lives. I knew he was right. The past 5 years had been a waking nightmare. Every day a struggle against the memories and the fear. If there was even a chance of ending it, of finding some kind of resolution. Okay, I said finally. What do you suggest we do? Jack squeezed my hand, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. First, we need to gather evidence. If this thing is real, if it's been out there all this time, there must be traces of it. Footprints, hair samples, something. I nodded slowly, my mind racing. And then? Then we analyze what we find. We reach out to experts, biologists, anthropologists, anyone who might be able to help us make sense of it. And if we're right, if this thing is trying to communicate. He trailed off, and I finished the thought for him. We try to communicate back. The idea was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Part of me wanted to dismiss it entirely, to retreat back into the safety of denial and disbelief. But I knew that wasn't an option anymore. Not after tonight. It's crazy, I said, shaking my head. You know that, right? Jack laughed, a sound I hadn't heard in far too long. Completely insane. But what other choice do we have? I looked out the window, half expecting to see the shadow again,